I pulled into the rest stop outside of Marillo at 4 in the morning, engine ticking, coffee going cold in the cup holder. 6 weeks on the Midwest haul, Cincinnati to Phoenix, back up through Denver, across Kansas, repeat. My dispatcher had called 2 days early to tell me the load fell through. Shipper went bankrupt, mid-route. And I was deadheading home with an empty trailer and nothing but flat Texas highway to think about. I'd imagined coming home differently. My daughter Nora running down the driveway maybe. Her grandmother Patricia standing at the screen door with that look she got when she was trying not to cry. Instead, I sat at that rest stop for 20 minutes, just sitting there, engine off, listening to the silence. I called Patricia before I left. No answer. Left a voicemail. Called again an hour outside of town. Still nothing. That was unusual. Patricia picked up on the first ring, always. There was a point of pride with her. The house was dark when I pulled up. 6:15 in the morning and no lights on, not even the kitchen. Patricia's car was in the driveway, but her movements were off. I used my key. The house smelled like nobody had cooked in it for a week. That faint, closed-up smell, recycled air and old coffee. Nora's room first. Her bed was made. That stopped me at the door. My 11-year-old daughter had never made her bed voluntarily in her life. Her desk was cleared. The journals she kept, she was always writing in them, always, since she was 7, and learned she could use words the way other kids use toys. They were gone. All of them. The shelf where she kept them was empty. I stood there for a minute, just looking at that empty shelf. Patricia came down the hallway in her robe, already awake, which meant she'd heard me come in and hadn't come out. That told me something, too. Where's Nora? She's at a program. She's fine. What program? Patricia sat down at the kitchen table instead of answering right away. That was when I noticed she'd aged since I'd last seen her. Not the normal kind of aging, but the kind that happens when someone has been carrying something heavy. She was 63 years old, and that morning she looked 70. There's a residential program, she said finally. Behavioral and academic enrichment. Pastor Gideon runs it out of Calvary Crossroads, about 40 miles east. Nora was struggling, you know that. After everything with her mother, with Claire, and a school counselor mentioned it, and Pastor Gideon said he'd seen real transformation in kids who... How long has she been there? Patricia looked at her hands. 5 weeks. I was on that run for 6 weeks. Nora had been somewhere I didn't know about for 5 of them. Why didn't you tell me? I tried to call and the signal always cut out, and Pastor Gideon said it was better for the children not to have outside contact during the adjustment period, that it helped them bond with the program, and he seemed so certain, and Nora was having such a hard time since Claire died. And give me the address. She did. She also gave me a flyer she'd picked up at the church, glossy stock, full color. Calvary Crossroads Youth Restoration Initiative. Photographs of smiling teenagers in clean clothes, sunlit fields in the background, everyone looking purposeful and healthy. Words like renewal and discipline and godly character formation. I left without finishing my coffee. The drive east took 45 minutes. The address took me off the state highway onto a county road, then off the county road onto what was basically a farm track. Red dirt, mesquite scrub on both sides. No cell signal past the first mile marker. I hadn't seen a building in 10 minutes when the place appeared. A cluster of metal-sided structures around an older cinder block building with a cross mounted on the roof. A chain-link fence, a parking area with 3 trucks, and a white van with CCYRI stenciled on the doors in blue. The gate was closed. A man sitting in a lawn chair next to it stood up when I pulled in. He was built wide and thick, wearing khakis and a polo shirt with the same acronym on the chest. He raised one hand. This is a closed campus, sir. I'm here for my daughter, Nora Webb. He pulled out a phone. No unscheduled visits during... Open the gate. I heard them before I saw them. Not singing, not like the flyer had suggested. A rhythmic sound, mechanical. I looked past the fence toward the larger of the metal buildings, and I could see through the open roll-up door. A long space, warehouse style. Fluorescent lighting. Rows of folding tables. Children sitting at them, heads down. What are they doing in there? Learning valuable skills. Life readiness. The program. I went around the fence. It ended about 30 yards to the left, where the property butted up against a dry creek bed, and there was no barrier there, just brush. The man shouted something behind me. I heard him on his radio. The warehouse floor smelled like solvent and cardboard. The children were assembling something, small mechanical components. I couldn't tell what from the door. Maybe 20 of them. 8, 9, 10 years old up to maybe 14 or 15. They sat in silence except for the clicking of parts. A woman in a denim shirt walked the rows with a clipboard. Nora was near the back. I knew her by her hair, Claire's hair, dark and wavy and always slightly tangled, and by the particular way she hunched over a task when she was concentrating on it. She wore a gray t-shirt that was too big for her. Her shoulders were thin in a way that made me stop walking. She looked up. She went completely still. Not the good kind of still. The kind that happens when a person has taught themselves not to react to things. Dad. Her voice was flat at first, like she wasn't sure if I was real. Then a crack. She was out of her chair and across the floor before I had time to think, and when she hit me, she was shaking, and I could feel her ribs through the t-shirt, every one of them. I thought you weren't coming. Her face was pressed into my shoulder. I thought you decided it was easier without me. Pastor Gideon said you knew about the program, that you'd agreed to it, that you were glad I was here. Because I was too much to deal with. He said Mom dying was hard on you, and I made it harder, and this was the best place for me. She was 11. She had believed this for 5 weeks. I've got you. I said it into her hair. I've got you, and I'm not going anywhere. The woman with the clipboard was beside us. This is not... I picked Nora up. She locked her arms around my neck. She hadn't let me carry her since she was 8, and she was too big for it now, but neither of us acknowledged that. The other children had stopped working. They were watching us. Some of them had expressions I recognized from my own daughter's face, that flat, careful stillness. One girl, maybe 9 years old, raised her hand slightly and then put it back down like she'd caught herself doing something forbidden. A man appeared at the far end of the warehouse. 60 or so, gray-haired, dressed better than everyone else, slacks, a blue Oxford, reading glasses hanging from the neck. He walked toward us with the particular calm of someone who had handled interruptions before, professionally calm, practiced, Mr. Webb. His voice was warm. I could imagine it being very convincing in a sanctuary. I understand you're concerned. Can we step into my office and discuss? What are these children assembling? He paused half a second. Tactile learning, fine motor skills, vocational preparation. Are they being paid? The pieces are donated by our ministry partners. The children learn responsibility and... Are they being paid? He looked at me without changing expression. They are learning to contribute. That is the payment. Character cannot be purchased, Mr. Webb. Character is earned through... I started walking toward the door. Nora held on. You cannot remove her without authorization from her legal guardian. Your mother, Patricia, signed a residential agreement that transferred. My daughter is 11 years old. She is not a ward of your ministry. The agreement is legally binding. The clipboard woman had moved to the door. 2 of the men from outside had appeared behind her. If you remove Nora, we will contact the sheriff's department and report a custodial interference. We have done this before. The sheriff knows our program. We have a relationship with. Then call them. I pushed past the clipboard woman. One of the men grabbed my arm. I turned and looked at him. I had been driving trucks for 15 years. My hands are not soft. He looked at my face and made a decision and let go. The man behind him didn't. He went for Nora, hands reaching for her shoulders, and Nora made a sound. I have never stopped hearing. A short, sharp sound, not a scream. Something that had been trained down to something smaller. I turned and put myself between them and kept moving, and the second man stumbled and went down. Pastor Gideon had his phone out, recording. I kept walking. There were 2 sheriff's cruisers in the parking area when I got outside. They must have called before I even reached the warehouse floor. One deputy was younger, maybe 30, talking to the gate man. The other was maybe 50, heavier, standing with his arms crossed. He looked at me coming out of the building with a child attached to me, and 3 men coming out behind me. and he said quietly, "Need everyone to stop." Everyone stopped. Everyone stopped. Pastor Gideon stepped forward. He did the wounded dignity thing. A parent has entered our campus without authorization and physically assaulted 2 of our staff members. I have it on video. This man is attempting to remove a child who is legally in our care under a signed residential agreement with her. The older deputy looked at Nora. He took his time doing it. Her too big shirt, her arms, her face. "Sweetheart," he said, "can you tell me your name?" She told him. He asked her how old she was. She told him that too. "How long have you been here?" 5 weeks. The deputy looked at the building behind us, at the parking area, at the white van. He looked at Pastor Gideon with an expression that wasn't angry, exactly, but had made a decision. "Pastor, I'm going to need a full tour of the facility. Right now." Pastor Gideon smiled. "Of course, though technically you'd need I've got a minor who appears to have been in residential care without parental consent and who exhibits signs of potential neglect. That's my probable cause. Let's go." What happened over the next 6 hours was slow and bureaucratic and relentless. The younger deputy stayed with me and Nora in my truck, while his partner went to the buildings with Pastor Gideon. Child Protective Services arrived around noon. State Police at 1:30. A woman from the county attorney's office around 3. They found 26 children on the property. The sleeping quarters were in the back of the cinder block building. 2 large rooms, bunk beds, no windows, a single bathroom for the whole group. The children slept from 9:30 p.m. to 4:30 a.m. The rest of the time was divided between assembly work. The components turned out to be parts for industrial ventilation equipment sold to a manufacturer in Houston, and what the program called formation time, which was Pastor Gideon lecturing the children about their moral failings, about being burdens to their families, about how work was the only path to worth. If a child cried or refused to work or asked to contact their family, they went to the reflection room. A storage closet. No light. An hour minimum. Nora had been in the reflection room 4 times. The first time was the second day, when she asked if she could call Patricia to say she'd arrived safely. A paramedic checked Nora in my truck. Mild malnutrition. Vitamin deficiencies. A respiratory infection that hadn't been treated. She'd lost 9 pounds in 5 weeks. She refused to be taken to the hospital without me. "I'll follow," I told her. "I'm not leaving this parking lot without you." She thought about it for a long moment, and then nodded. And when they put her in the ambulance, she watched out the back window until she couldn't see my truck anymore, and then looked forward. I followed the ambulance. I kept my headlights on her the whole way. Patricia arrived at the hospital around 7 that evening. She stood in the hallway outside Nora's room, and she looked at her granddaughter through the glass, and she didn't say anything for a long time. Then she turned to me and said, "He told me this was like boarding school. He said the structure would help her. I never saw where she was sleeping. I never saw the work. I thought, you thought the glossy flyer was the whole truth." "I know," she said. "I know." She tried to go into the room. Nora looked at her and then looked away. Patricia came back into the hallway and cried, quietly, which was the most dignified and the worst thing I had ever watched her do. The charges came down over the following months. Pastor Gideon, his legal name was Gerald Oates, no formal religious credentials, was indicted on 17 federal counts: labor trafficking of minors, child abuse, fraud, interstate commerce violations because the ventilation parts crossed state lines. His residential agreement, the one Patricia had signed, had been designed to obscure what it actually transferred. A contract attorney the county brought in said she'd never seen language that deliberately complex applied to what was supposed to be a church summer program. Gerald Oates maintained throughout the pretrial proceedings that he had been helping these children. He said it in the parking lot when the handcuffs went on. He said it at the arraignment. He had been troubled youth himself, he said, had been through difficult programs as a teenager, had emerged with discipline and purpose, and he was trying to give these children the same gift. He got 43 years. No parole consideration. 4 of his staff members got sentences between 8 and 22 years. A 5th cooperated with prosecutors and received a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony about 3 other locations, 2 in Texas, 1 in Oklahoma, where similar operations were running. Narred him home to a different apartment. I'd quit the long hauls before the indictment even came down. Local deliveries only, home every night. We got a 2-bedroom in a complex with a pool she never used but liked looking at. She had her own room, which she painted a dark blue-gray that I thought was too dark, and then spent about a week looking at and realized was exactly right. She didn't write for 2 months. Her journals had been confiscated when she arrived at the program. Pastor Gideon believed personal writing encouraged pride and self-focus, and she never got them back. They weren't in the evidence inventory. I bought her 3 new ones from a bookstore, good ones with thick paper, and I'd put them on her desk, and for 8 weeks they sat there untouched. Then, one night, I woke up at 2 in the morning and there was a light under her door. She was at her desk writing. She wrote for 3 hours. In the morning she was still asleep when I left for my route, and the journal was face down on the desk like she didn't want to see it, and I did not open it, and I did not ask. Slowly she started to come back. Not all at once. Not the way you hope it will happen, sudden and clear. It was more like water coming back into a landscape after a drought. Small things first, patches here and there. Then gradually, more connected. She started talking at dinner. Then she started laughing occasionally. Short, surprised laughs, like she'd forgotten she could. Then she started writing in her room with the light on and the door open, which felt like something, some small signal. Her therapist's name was Dr. Anita Reeves. Nora saw her twice a week for the first year, then once a week, then twice a month. Dr. Anita Reeves told me once, in one of our check-in conversations, that Nora was processing not just the 5 weeks but everything before them, her mother's illness, Claire's death, the particular loneliness of having a father who loved her but wasn't present enough. The program hadn't created all of Nora's wounds, Dr. Reeves said. It had exploited the ones that were already there. That was by design. I thought about that for a long time. 14 months after we came home, a nonprofit that worked with trafficking survivors asked if Nora would participate in a journal-based program. They were collecting written accounts from young people who'd experienced labor or commercial exploitation to be used in legislative testimony and in educational materials for schools. Nora could participate under a pen name. Her account would be read by state legislators. It might help change the legal definitions around residential agreements and parental consent. She thought about it for a week. Then she wrote 12 pages and handed them to me without saying anything. I read them at the kitchen table after she went to school. She wrote about the first night, about how she thought it was like camp, and then realized it wasn't. She wrote about the assembly line, about learning to make her hands move without thinking about what she was doing, about how that felt like practice for disappearing. She wrote about the other children, about a girl named Brea who taught herself to sleep standing up so she'd be ready when the lights came on, about a boy named Thomas who kept a small, smooth rock in his pocket that he'd found on the first day and carried every day after because it was the only thing in the building that no one had given him as a tool. She wrote about believing I'd left her. She wrote about the specific moment she'd stopped believing it, which wasn't when I walked into the warehouse. It was later, at the hospital, when I sat in the chair next to her bed and fell asleep there, still in my work clothes, and she woke up in the night and I was still there. I made coffee, and I cried at the kitchen table for about 20 minutes, and then I washed my face and went to work. The testimony went to the state legislature that spring. A bill passed the following year expanding the definition of child residential facilities under Texas law, requiring parental access visits, prohibiting labor as part of residential programs, and mandating independent oversight for any faith-based residential placement. Nora's account was quoted 3 times on the floor of the state Senate, anonymously by a senator from San Antonio. 3 years after the warehouse, Nora turned 14. She asked if we could drive out to the Calvary Crossroads property, just to see it. The buildings were gone. The county had condemned the cinder block structure, and the metal-sided warehouses had been taken down. The property had been purchased at auction, and someone had started putting in a fence line for what looked like it would be a small horse operation. There were posts in the ground, red dirt, no mesquite. Whoever bought it had cleared the scrub. We stood at the edge of the county road through the chain link. "It's smaller than I remembered," Nora said. "Places usually are." She looked at the empty lot for a while. "Thomas still has that rock," she said. We text sometimes. He's in San Antonio now. He's going to be a geologist. He wants to study rocks for a living. I thought that was probably the most determined act of meaning-making I'd ever heard of. He says Dr. Reeves told him it's called post-traumatic growth, Nora continued. She said it's when what happened to you becomes part of what makes you. Not the only thing, but part of it. Do you believe that? She thought about it the way she thinks about everything, completely, before she answered. I think I'm working on believing it. I don't think you have to already believe it for it to be true. We drove home. She fell asleep in the passenger seat somewhere around the county line. I kept the radio off and drove the back roads instead of the highway. At the trial, the prosecutor had asked one of Pastor Gideon's staff members, a woman who'd received a reduced sentence for cooperation, why the children never tried to run. She said there were two reasons. The first was physical. They were exhausted, underfed, on an unmarked road with no cell signal. The second was something else. Pastor Gideon had told each child individually during their first week that their family had been relieved to place them in the program, that their parents had described them as difficult, exhausting, a burden, that the program was where they were because no one at home had wanted the full weight of them. He told Nora she was the reason her mother's last months had been so hard, that grief had made her selfish, and her selfishness had made my grief worse, and that was why I had agreed so readily to a full residential placement. She was 11 years old. She had no way to check that. She had no phone, no mail, no visitors. She had only what she was told, repeated day after day, by adults in a place that called itself a ministry. I thought about that a lot in the years after. Not about Gerald Oates, particularly. He could spend the rest of his life in federal prison, and I wouldn't lose sleep. I thought about the mechanism, the way it worked on children who already had a wound, a lost parent, a distracted surviving parent, instability, grief, and pressed on that wound deliberately and systematically until they stopped believing they deserved to leave. I thought about how I had been so desperate those 6 weeks on the road to believe that Patricia could hold things together, that I had chosen a job that kept me gone because being home with the particular shape of our grief was harder than being somewhere else, and I had called it providing for my family because that framing let me sleep. I am not comparing my failures to what Gerald Oates did, but I am not pretending my failures weren't there. The lesson I came away with, the only one that felt honest, that didn't reduce into a slogan, was this: presence is not optional. Not because children will fall apart without constant supervision. They won't. They're resilient in ways that break your heart, but because the absence of a parent who is paying attention is the thing these operations look for. It is what they require. They need the gap. They fill the gap with themselves. The gap had been there. I had put it there, one long-haul route at a time. Nora was 15 when she entered her first piece of writing in a regional youth competition. It was creative nonfiction. She submitted it under her real name. They won second place in the 14-18 division, and the judge's comment said, with admirable restraint, "This writer is not afraid of what she knows." She framed the comment, "It's on the wall above her desk. I've been doing local deliveries for 4 years now, home by 6, dinner that I've had time to actually cook. Nora does homework at the kitchen table sometimes while I'm at the stove, and she narrates what she's studying. Geology now, partly because of Thomas. And I listen and ask questions and mostly don't understand the answers, but that's fine. On the first Tuesday of every month, I give a talk at a parent education session organized by a trafficking prevention nonprofit. The sessions are in libraries, community centers, church fellowship halls. I tell people what to look for. Programs that limit or discourage parental contact. Residential placements that require you to sign anything that includes the phrase residential authority or program guardian. Any organization that describes a child as a burden in need of correction. Any program you found through a church bulletin or a forwarded email that you cannot independently verify. Any organization that is unreachable by phone during regular hours or that routes all calls through a single contact person. I tell them about Nora with her permission. I tell them about what she wrote. I tell them about the rock in Thomas's pocket. I do not make it easy. I did not let them feel comfortable. These operations succeed because people want to be reassured that the glossy flyer matches the truth, and I am not in the business of reassurance. But I also tell them what the county attorney told me a year after the verdict, when I ran into her at a gas station. She was still thinking about the case, she said. Still thinking about the deputy who'd gone in without a warrant on probable cause and had trusted what he saw in that parking lot. She said, the whole thing turned on one person who didn't look away. That's not a comfortable lesson. It means the work is always personal, always specific, always on you. It doesn't resolve into a policy or a hotline or a checklist, though those things matter too. It resolves into a human being standing in a parking lot with a choice about whether to keep walking or whether to stop and look at what is actually in front of them. I had been lucky. The haul fell through. The shipper went bankrupt. I came home 2 days early. I called and Patricia didn't answer. I drove east at 5 in the morning instead of sleeping first. I was lucky. Nora was lucky. Thomas still has his rock. He sent me a photograph of it last year. Just a small, smooth, gray piece of limestone. Nothing special to look at. He said he'd figured out what kind of stone it was. He was in college by then, studying geology at UT Austin, and that it had come from a formation about 40 million years old. He said he liked knowing that. He said it helped to know that the thing he'd held on to without understanding why had been around for 40 million years, and would be around for 40 million more. I printed the photograph and put it on my refrigerator. Nora saw it there that afternoon after school. She read his note, which I'd taped next to the photograph. She stood there for a long moment. Then she said quietly, almost to herself, "We're not just what happened to us." I didn't say anything. Some things don't need a response. She got a snack from the refrigerator and went to her room to study. I could hear her through the door, murmuring the names of geological periods like a list of something that had lasted. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all this. Not in a dramatic way. Just quietly, the way you think about things when you're driving an empty highway at 5 in the morning and there's nothing to distract you from what's true. Gerald Oates didn't build his operation in a vacuum. He built it in a gap. The gap was real. I had put it there. 6 weeks on the road, then 6 more, then another cycle, telling myself that the paycheck was the point. That providing was the same thing as being present. That a girl with a roof over her head and food on the table was a girl who was being taken care of. Those things are not the same. I know that now in a way I didn't know before, and I wish I'd had to learn it differently. The thing about a gap is that something always fills it. Nature, people, institutions, they all move toward empty space. What filled the gap in Nora's life was a man who understood exactly what an 11-year-old grieving her mother needed to hear, and who used that understanding as a weapon. He told her she was a burden. He told her I'd agreed to place her there because she'd made my grief harder. He knew those words would land because he'd identified exactly where the wound was. That's not evil in some abstract sense. That's a specific, calculated intelligence applied to harm. Knowing that doesn't make me less angry. It makes me more precise about what I'm angry at. What I keep coming back to is this. Nora survived. She came back. She's writing. She's studying. She's texting Thomas about geology and entering competitions under her real name. That happened not because the system worked, but because one shipping contract fell through and one deputy didn't look away, and one girl held on to who she was even when she was told daily that who she was wasn't worth holding on to. That's not a policy. That's not a program. That's resilience, which is a word people throw around so easily that it's lost most of its weight. But what I mean by it is specific. Nora kept something intact inside herself that no one could reach. She kept writing in her head. Even when her journals were gone, she kept noticing things. The other children, Brea learning to sleep standing up, Thomas and his rock. She stayed curious about the world even when the world in front of her was a warehouse floor. I don't know where that comes from. I'd like to say I gave it to her, but I wasn't there enough to claim that credit. I think some of it came from Claire, her mother, who was the most quietly stubborn person I ever knew. I think some of it is just Nora. What I do know is that resilience is not the same as being okay with what happened. Nora is not okay with what happened. She's built something from it, which is different and harder and more honest than being okay. She made the choice at 14 to put her name, her real name, on 12 pages describing the worst 5 weeks of her life, so that legislators in Austin could read it and change a law. That is not recovery. That is something more than recovery. That is something more than recovery. That is a person deciding that what was done to her will not be the last word. The cause and effect chain that matters isn't the one that led to the warehouse. It's the one that leads forward. Every parent who learns to ask the right questions, every deputy who trusts what they see, every child who gets to stay home. That chain is built one link at a time by people who decided not to look away. Nora put the photograph of Thomas's rock on her own wall eventually. She said she liked the 40 million year number. She said it put things in proportion. I think she's right about that. And I think she's been right about more things than I gave her credit for, and I'm paying attention now. That's the only thing I know how to offer. I'm paying attention now.